People who like bad fighting games will probably know Video System for Tao Taito. Otherwise, you'll probably know them for the Arrow Fighters series. However, if you look at Video System's library from 1986 to their closure in 2004, you'll find a lot of mahjong sprinkled in with other titles of varying genres. Their first effort was 1986's Ojanko Yakata, which is one of those weird mahjong games where you play against a pretty anime lady to get her to date you or something. It's the or something part that really worries me in these types of games. Their next outing was a very odd shoot-'em-up known as Rabio Lepus, and the topic of today's video. Arrow Fighters was always heavy on the silly side, despite its fairly average-looking planes and tanks. Conversely, Rabio Lepus is on the serious side, despite its wacky colors and premise. The game looks like it's set up to be a light-hearted romp, but many of its enemies are actually semi-disturbing juxtaposed against its cute rabbit protagonist. This odd half-in, half-out approach unfortunately sets the tone for a short-lived series marred by half measures, willing to go out on a limb and do something different, but not enough to make it matter. Rabio Lepus, known as Rabbit Punch stateside, doesn't appear to have been a smash hit, and in fact, it only got one more pseudo outing. But Video System themselves seem to be big fans of their sophomore effort, as the characters introduced in this game turn up in multiple V-System games, sometimes even as playable characters. Rabbit Punch was one of the first video games I remember playing ever, period, so part of me is sad that it didn't go further than it did, but playing it again now in 2023, I can see why. The game oozes charm and an obvious desire to liven up the tired sci-fi themes of its contemporaries like Gradius and R-Type. Despite the desire, the innovations it does do don't go far enough, and the things it tries to copy aren't executed as well. Grab some canned carrots and it's time for a deep dive into Rabio Lepus. The story is an odd place to start talking about a shoot-'em-up, since it's not exactly a genre known for having deep lore, but Rabio Lepus actually presents what story it has very well. It's no War and Peace, but it's more than most of what its peers got. You see, the Demon King and his army have invaded Bunnyland from space. They kidnapped the royal family, too. They escape into space with the Usagi Corps, that's you, in hot pursuit on their tail. The game's flyer also makes a point to mention that the Demon King has not only good magic, but excellent technology as well. It's like they knew this game's aesthetic was an unholy fusion of technology and whatever this is.
You are not prepared!
Tom Jones used to say it's not unusual for a shoot-'em-up to have a story weaker than a New Englander's attempt at making sweet tea, but the effort that Video System put into presenting Rabio Lepus' story is quite unusual. The intro has really nice story scenes, and the ending scenes also have several pieces of artwork and text. And as you rescue each member of the royal family throughout the game, you'll get a brief interlude and a thank you from said family member, and some more nice artwork as they ask you to find the remaining family members. The introductory cutscene also shows everyone that's been kidnapped and changes to show different amounts of bunnies depending on whether you started the game on a one-player or two-player game. It's one of those little touches that doesn't really mean much in the long run, but it does show some love was put into the game beyond just making it work. I doubt I Beat a Video Game will do a 5-hour expose on it anytime soon, but Rabio presents what story it has very nicely for a shoot-'em-up, and I really like the effort they put in with it. The first thing you'll notice about Rabio Lepus is how colorful it is. The playable characters are vibrant red and green, the planet has bright blue skies, and most enemy bullets flash rainbow color. But despite the cute colors, the gameplay makes use of a wide variety of enemy types, both robotic and organic. There are some bosses, like Stage 6's Ghost, that seem like it could have fit in Konami's Peridia series. And then there's this. Tonally, this game is all over the place, but you're not really playing a shoot-'em-up for the tone or story, are you?
Then again, maybe you did.
Rabbit Punch is divided up into 3 areas with 4 stages each, and as you make progress through the game, you'll see a map screen come up in between levels to tell you where you're headed next. You'll go stage by stage and defeat each boss until you beat them all, and after you beat each boss, the sky rains carrots, and you have to grab as many as you can before any of them hit the ground. Once one hits the ground, the level ends and proceeds to the next stage, and you can't grab anymore. The bonus carrots at level end do restore your health too, so you want to make sure you grab as many as you can to fill your health back up for the next level. Every 4 levels, the theme changes. You start out in a spaceship, move to an asteroid base, and finish up the game on the Demon King's home planet, which is slightly cheery for a Demon King planet. 10 to 12 stages was pretty standard length for a shoot 'em up at this time, but Rabbit Punch's stages are all fairly short, and each fourth stage is a boss stage only. We'll talk more about the bosses later, but first let's discuss some game mechanics. The player 1 side plays Rabio, the red rabbit, and the player 2 side plays Lepus, the green rabbit. And yes, those are their canonical names. The colors, however, are just to designate players. There's no asymmetrical silkworm-style gameplay here, sadly. Both rabbits have segmented health bars at the bottom of the screen, which is somewhat rare for shoot-'em-ups at the day. The health bars each act as lives, and when you deplete one and die, your character gets up to fight again in the same place they were if they have more health bars left. As long as you don't lose the life completely, you can restore segments on your health bar by finding carrots throughout the level, which is another really generous mechanic for a genre where getting hit is usually instant death. The cabinet that I played on as a kid, I swear it would let you put 1 quarter in and play as Lepus if you use the 2-player side. But in MAME and the Switch port, the only way to press the 2-player start is by putting in 2 credits, and that forces a 2-player game. It makes me wonder if there's some undumped version of this out there that allows you to play a single-player game as the Green Rabbit. Both characters move in 8 directions and have a laser attack as their main weapon. It's called a laser, but it looks more like missiles being fired out rapidly if you ask me. A laser that's made out of missiles sounds like the most American thing ever. Arcade operators have access to a dip switch setting that makes the laser either semi-automatic or manual. In manual mode, 1 press equals 1 bullet, and 1 visit to the physical therapist office for carpal tunnel syndrome. The much more reasonable semi-automatic setting makes the laser fire rapidly as long as the button is held down, but you have to let off it every once in a while to let it cool down, or the amount of bullets you fire slowly drops to 1 at a time. This means, for best results, you want to fire in concentrated burst. It's an odd design choice for a genre that usually just lets you hold down the button to fire your main weapon, but bosses in Rabio Lepus have very little health, so perhaps they thought this compensated for that. As a secondary weapon, you can fire out a missile salvo that homes in on enemies. The missile salvo is pretty darn strong, but you can blow through it very quickly because there's no cooldown between firing it. Canned carrots throughout the level function as the game's way of delivering power-ups. You can find missiles, point bags, and more in them if you shoot or punch them, but don't fly directly into them because this knocks them off the screen without giving you the power-up inside. Sometimes while breaking open these canned carrots, you'll find a bow. While equipped on your character, it makes your missiles able to pass through objects and damage them while in contact rather than just hitting them and exploding. It's insanely powerful, but very easy to lose. Getting hit knocks the ribbon off and it starts to float away. You can get it again if you touch the ribbon before it leaves the screen, but 90% of the game, you're going to want to stay as far to the left of the screen as possible. So as soon as you take a hit, it'll be gone before you have a chance to catch it, unless you're playing very risky. A homing missile salvo isn't exactly the most unique power-up in a shooting game either, but luckily, Rabio Lepus has one more unique mechanic up its sleeve. Both rabbits have a melee punch that they can execute when in close range, and other than the kill on contact invincibility power-up, the punch is hands down the strongest attack in the game. These stone heads, for example, that take tons of shots to kill, can be killed instantly with the punch attack, and it even works on some bosses despite there not being a really safe way to land it. If you do happen to take a death against a boss, though, you respawn with a few seconds of invincibility, so you can fly right up to them and melee them and nearly end the fight instantly depending on their health. The punch is both the game's biggest innovation and its biggest wasted opportunity. It doesn't have a dedicated button, and it only activates automatically by firing in melee range, and only sometimes. Perhaps they were thinking this would make the player think about what to melee and when to shoot, but it's so dangerous to get close to enemies, it doesn't really work out that way in practice. Most shoot-'em-ups have enemies that fire directly at you, and some enemies that just sort of shoot everywhere, and you have to dodge it all. But the vast majority of Rabio's enemies spray 3-bullet homing burst shots directly at you, and will continue to target you as you move around the screen. Attempting to get close to a boss or enemy that's rapid-firing homing bullets is a surefire way to end up dead, so you'll spend most of your time at the edge of the screen trying to pick them off before they fill up the screen with rainbow death. Rabbit Punch is interesting, but not really a hidden gem. Maybe there's some shoot-'em-up board somewhere that loves it, but it's fairly obscure, and you won't find many glowing reviews of it hidden away anywhere. Unless they're from me in 2004, that is. As you play through the game a few times, it becomes apparent why. The melee combat is either unbalanced or completely unusable. Most of its utility will come while you're invincible for a few seconds after respawning. The boss of Stage 8 illustrates this problem perfectly. If one person dies, they can end the fight immediately upon respawning by punching this guy in the mouth. Generally, when you star a mechanic in your game, you want to design your game around it so that it can really shine and make the game stand out, but the punch is more of an afterthought in Rabio Lepus. Most enemies and bosses don't have what you'd call patterns, but just fire directly at you 100% of the time. I guess Video System expected their low health to compensate. Consider the bosses in something like R-Type. Very difficult and hard, yes, but it feels a lot more fair because if you know where to go on the screen or how to fly, you can take down the bosses with ease. Bosses here just feel like a mad dash to the end. It's often better to spam missiles at the start of the fight and end the boss before it has a chance to start filling the screen with nonsense rather than to learn its pattern and exploit it. Most of Rabio's contemporaries will also make you start from a checkpoint after taking a death, but V-System opted to have you pick up right from where you left off when you die, even if you have to use a continue. This is a very, very player-friendly system, especially if you're paying in the arcade, but it also makes the game fairly short and lowers the stakes significantly. The game isn't that long either, so if the arcade operator had it set on a generous difficulty setting and the automatic laser turned on, a competent shoot-'em-up player could probably bang out this thing in maybe 6 or 7 coins. As a vet of the game, I've made it to stage 9 without losing a life, so I know an expert shooter fan could pull it off. While we're talking about the coin to gameplay ratio, let's talk a bit about the game's localization in the West, Rabbit Punch. Midway Bally Sentai chose to publish this game for some reason, and in typical Midway fashion, they made some less than stellar changes. Since it's possible to just brute force your way through the whole game with coins, they decided to make it so that anytime you continue past stage 9, you're sent back to stage 9, meaning you have to complete the last world on 1 credit. I guess this game has more in common with Silkworm than I thought. Never mind the fact that the last 2 levels have no missiles or other power-ups. This means you have to finish level 9 and 10 without using any missiles to save them for the last 2 levels. Also, Midway Sentai version falls prey to the good old 90s video game censorship bug. You see, Rabio's story involves rescuing the royal family of Bunnyland, and one of them is dressed in a bunny outfit. You know, like Bulma wore in Dragon Ball. The kind that boys who like to play are famous for. It's funny to think that Midway would later be perfectly fine with showing off stuff like the dancers in cages in Revolution X, but Bally Sentai was its own division, so maybe just their personal dislike of bunny girls came into play. The morals of censorship aside, this problem ruins a lot of the story of Rabio, and further harms its identity as a shooter. The mechanics were already bland, but at least the story images and artwork were all unique and well drawn. The picture of the royal family tied up at the beginning is removed, as is the cutscene of the bunny girl after the stage 4 boss. In fact, the only bunny character left in the game is the king on stage 8. The bunny princess who's rescued at the end of the game is also completely removed, despite being fully clothed and not suggestive in the least. The only reason I can imagine she was removed is because with the opening picture gone, players wouldn't know who she was, but honestly they made it nearly impossible to actually finish Rabbit Punch, so who was there to be confused? They did make the health bar graphics look cleaner at least, so that's good I guess. To Midway Bally Sentai's credit, they do have the only localization of this series on record. The VHS System eventually did open a branch in the West known as Miko River, who published all their games in the West, but they didn't come around until 1993, so maybe that's why Midway Bally Sentai got to butcher Rabbit Punch for its Western release. Miko River only published 6 or so games in the USA, so their sophomoric shooter effort never got a proper localization with all its content intact. Speaking of ports, you know what else didn't get ported to the USA? I'd be remiss to review Rabio and Rabbit Punch and not mention Rabio Lepus Special. The Rabio Lepus Special was released to the PC Engine in Japan in 1990. This may seem like an odd choice, but remember that the PC Engine was much more successful in Japan than its Western counterpart, the TurboGrafx 16. What's strange, however, is that Rabio Lepus Special doesn't really take advantage of much of the PC Engine's capabilities and instead is one of those direct not-a-port remixes. To give another PC Engine example, remember how Konami chose the PC Engine to release their magnum opus classic Castlevania, Rondo of Blood, and then released a hacked-up, watered-down, not-a-port version to the Super Nintendo? Rabio Lepus Special is kinda like that. The gameplay is unchanged, but most of the worlds have been truncated into singular levels where you stop every so often and fight a boss rather than short sets of levels with a boss and a map screen in between. There are some reworked enemy designs and behavior as well as a few new enemy types, but if you've played the arcade game, you've seen most of this before. The worst thing about Rabio Lepus Special is that it's even harder than its arcade counterpart. You have 3 shields per life, like in the arcade version, but this time when you die, you don't get back up where you were, but instead have to restart the level from a preset checkpoint. Restarting at checkpoints is nothing new for a shoot-'em-up, and it's a good way to balance unlimited credits with an actual challenge, but Rabio Lepus Special isn't an arcade game, and it doesn't have unlimited credits. It's a home release. You already bought the game. You shouldn't be punished for that, but you are. Alas, in the 1990s, recreating the arcade at home was just what people wanted and what game companies did. This game uses artificial credits. Every time you run out of lives, you need to use a credit to continue, and when you run out of credits, it's back to the beginning of the entire game. If I'd been making this game back in the 90s, I'd have ditched the credits and give you unlimited continues. When you ran out of lives, you'd go back to the beginning of the stage, and when you lost a life, back to a checkpoint. You know, Castlevania style. Sadly, it seems like they knew their game was short, and rather than making it longer, they just made it harder. If you're coming in from the arcade version, you're going to have to get used to not touching walls, because this game, unlike its arcade counterpart, plays by Gradius and R-type rules. Touching any surface but the ground kills you. In the arcade, you could ride along walls and columns to dodge bullets and position yourself easier. But here, areas with columns are just another death trap. It also means the concept of punching the stage to change it is abandoned nearly entirely. Maybe you think I'm just being a wuss, but this game is hard, even by shoot-'em-up standards. The sprites are all large and screen space is limited. You really only have the laser and missiles to deal with enemies since the punch is limited to close range, and close range is almost always a death sentence. You could do a successful not a port, but you gotta add more than that. Strangely, there are a set of cheat codes that you can put in on the menu to give you all new power-ups for your laser that do things like fire at an angle and shoot behind you, but why weren't these made standard pickups in the game? It would have given the game a unique identity from its arcade counterpart and fixed the lack of power-ups. But even with these cheats, they still screwed it up because if you enter a cheat code for one of these special ribbons, it's lost as soon as you touch an enemy and you can't get it again for the whole game. It'd be like if you owned a landscaping business and you started out with only a pair of hedge trimmers. This wasn't enough, so you bought 5 other tools to use but locked them up in your truck, and you only use one of them if you happen to forget your lunch and go back to the truck to get it. And then, when you stub your toe on a garden gnome, you toss it over the fence and never touch it again. If you have some sort of nostalgic attachment to the arcade version, check this one out as a curiosity, but it's probably going to be too hard for the average player. That said, some absolute GigaChad legend did make a fan translation of this game that changes the title to Rabbit Punch Special and translates all the cutscenes. So if you did want to experience it, but the inconsequential Japanese text was just too much for you, now's your chance. Although several Rabio Lepus characters made cameos in later V-System games, Rabio Lepus as a series never went very far past its PC Engine outing. There are a couple of reasons for that, but the most prominent one is that the game just doesn't do much outside of its odd premise and its poor attempt at introducing melee combat. At least the game is not totally forgotten. A company called Hamster has the rights to Rabio, and they ported the game to Switch. You can pick it up for about $8 on the eShop. Thankfully, Hamster had the sense to port the Japanese version of the game with all the cutscenes uncensored, and the original continue till the end gameplay. It would have been nice to see the cutscenes translated, but again, this cost $8. It does add a few score attack type modes and a few other things, so not great, but hey, it's a cheap, non-emulation way to emulate this game legally. There's also a port for the arcade collection that was released on PS2, but good luck finding that. Just go with the Switch port here. Here's to you, Rabio Lepus. You weren't the best game, but you had heart, and you tried. Here's hoping Rabio and the gang rides again one day.